All right. Are you running?
We're rolling.
Okay. Nanna, I would just like to ask if you could start off with some biographical information, and this would be, we'll have a caption under you that will say who you are, and there may even be reference to you by someone else, and we'll probably see you in action in the at the grain school. But if you could just answer these questions. For how long have you been promoting ancient and heirloom grains?
I've been promoting, ancient grains. I probably use that expression more, ancient or heritage grains, for the last 4 years or so. We had a transition in dining services at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, and we were looking for a lot more regional and local food. And that started in 2014. And we realized that we didn't have a lot of Colorado, grains, the ones that we wanted. We wanted to get the ancient wheats. And we saw that they were not available, but they used to be grown here, at least the heritage grains. And so it kind of spiraled into this research in 2016. And grain school happened the first time in January 2016.
Could you say what the difference between heirloom or heritage? Do you use the terms heirloom and heritage interchangeably?
I don't use so much the heirloom term,
I'll switch to heritage whenever where I have written heirloom. Could you say what you see as the difference between heritage and ancient wheat, and how they differ from modern wheat?
Yeah, so at least according to my knowledge and what I've picked up from the literature, I would say an ancient grain, an ancient wheat, for example, is one that hasn't changed for a long, long time. When we think about einkorn, the first wheat ever grown 10,000 years ago, that has not changed over time very much. And rightfully so, because when you compare einkorn to modern wheat, the yields are very different. So it was probably at some point dropped because it was just not interesting enough because of its production issues. So I relate to the ancient wheats, including spelt, as well as emmer. For heritage, I think more about those grains and those wheats that were grown in the US, also here along the Front Range, around 1850 to potentially 1920. And then things have really changed and dropped because of the hybrid process and hybridization of wheats, and especially corn at that time. So heritage grains for me are the ones that we used to grow here, but they have been dropped also because of yield issues in probably the latest 1920 or 30. But we were able to identify them based on research and publications by the USDA. So Red 5, for example, and Turkey Red, they were grown here in this region. And so for me, that's more of a heritage grain. It obviously was an ancient grain at some point, but it came over was transported by the Mennonites to Kansas for Turkey Red. And some of the Kansas farms have never dropped it, but we've lost it completely on the Front Range. And so the difference, when you think about these ancient and heritage grains versus modern wheats, there's quite a difference between the ancient grains and the modern wheat. I think when you look at heritage grains, they resemble modern wheat a little bit more, but all of these would have more nutrient density when you think about minerals, vitamins, antioxidants, especially when they are consumed in whole grain form. If we take a modern wheat and a heritage or ancient wheat and we remove most of its bran, most of its germ, and we leave only the endosperm, they are very similar. But when we leave on their natural trait, which is the grain in its whole entity, the ancient and heritage grains are much more nutritious.
Is this partly because maybe you could rephrase this when you answer, but is the fact that the modern wheats have less nutrient density, is it because they have been designed to have more endosperm?
Yeah, to some degree, I think, many of the ancient wheats are also high in protein, and they're high in gluten to some degree. Not all of them. Spelt, for example, is, but einkorn isn't. The gluten sits in the endosperm. So for sure, because we wanted to have fluffier breads and more baking quality, I think modern wheat has been bred to some degree for that trait, so that it would have more gluten and it would have a better baking capability. So for sure, but we are now, exploring the baking capabilities also of einkorn, and if you give it time. And not all einkorn is difficult to bake with. There are definitely some accessions of einkorn that are easier to bake with. So it's interesting, even within one species and subspecies of wheat, you find accessions in einkorn, for example, that have very good baking qualities. So it's quite interesting.
Yeah. Okay, another biographical question. Why did you become involved in this work? With wheat and grains more generally? Yeah,
so I'm originally from a grain country, right? Switzerland is a cereal nation, and I grew up in the middle of spelt fields. And I was a ski racer at the time, and I wasn't very strong when I was a little kid. But suddenly when I discovered all of the grain and muesli and cereal mixes and bread, I ate a lot of it. My mom just couldn't believe how, I would mix the cereals. My test was always whether the spoon would stick in that cereal bowl, whether there was enough bran and germ in there. And it gave me a strength. And so I surpassed my two sisters in ski racing. They were older than me, but somehow grain just is part of my life, and it's part of my strength and my energy. So the reason why I got involved with this grain movement is probably because I was missing it. And I think for my university here at UCCS in Colorado Springs, we transitioned our food service, and we wanted to integrate a lot more local and regional grain. And we found some. We have Colorado quinoa from the San Luis Valley, which is incredibly valuable and has a wonderful story. We found millet. Most of the millet production, organic millet production of the United States, is done in Colorado by Fort Collins. And so it served us well that we started the research in Colorado, but we couldn't find any interesting wheats. And so we did all of this research and decided to venture into grain trials. And so I started connecting with farmers in the region and trying to gauge their interest, whether they wanted to trial some of the grain. We got seed from a variety of different places, from USDA, from Coosa Seed Society, from Eli Rugosa's seed stock. I brought some over from Europe, and we just started trialing that with Rocky Mountain Seed Alliance in collaboration. And so I think the reason why I got involved was an inherent one, because I wanted to make our food system on campus more regional. And then it became full circle for me because I grew up with it, and it brought me back home in a way. It brought me back home to Switzerland and rediscovering einkorn and rye, Wallis rye particularly. And it became really important for me to set roots here in the Arkansas watershed with my Swiss inheritance. I don't know what it is, but it's very meaningful.
Great. Who would you say has been the primary audience for your work?
Primarily, and that started already when I came to Colorado Springs, it was the dietitian, the nutrition professional, having very little culinary training, very little or none of agricultural training. So from the beginning on, I envisioned a graduate program in nutrition with emphasis on sport, also emphasizing sustainability, local food systems, regional food systems, and understanding what to teach people in the kitchen These are nutrition professionals that ultimately will make the biggest impact on, you know, a nation and a society that has completely departed from a good healthy relationship with food. So primarily it was the dietitian. Secondarily, I think it's all young people, and it's families, it's parents, it's scientists. I think it's farmers, because we wanted to develop this grain chain, and that starts with farming. So I wanted to convince the farmers to think about their rotations and integrating a cover crop that they could actually eat, rather than feeding it to, you know, animals, which, you know, in a circular system would also be very good. But it's very critical, I think, for small and medium-sized farms to think about this with rotational and cover cropping in the winter, and then being able to harvest that grain for themselves, so it's sustenance for themselves. But then they could also link in with a miller and start their collaboration, and the miller can then link in with the baker. And some farmers that came to grain school, they took it, you know, vertically and started their own bakery. So it's very interesting to see how that integration has shaped. So for me, my audience is everyone. And I think I see myself mostly as a catalyst, and ultimately I am the one that tries to inspire the young people that I'm around, all of the students that I mentor, that then go out as nutrition professionals, as health professionals, as young people with families themselves, knowing where their food comes from, knowing that they can make their own bread in a kitchen, or they know where to go to the artisan bakery to get their healthy loaf. Mm-hmm. So it's really everyone.
So I'm probably going to come back to you about this topic when we talk about education. But before we get off of the biographical stuff, why do you prefer whole grains? What do you consider? You've already talked about this a little, but nutritionally, not just in terms of baking aesthetics, but nutritionally, why do you prefer whole grains, and what is wrong with white flour?
Yeah, you know, what is wrong with white flour? It's a loaded question, because everyone loves, you know, the white flour products, because they're also beautiful and flavorful. But when we think about it, white flour has almost nothing in it anymore. So you have this grain that's a nutritional gold medal, that has a bran layer around it, that has, you know, protein and carbohydrates, and in the middle we have the vitamin pill that I often express the germ as, right? The germ is really a vitamin pill, and it has essential oils that are so powerful in anti-inflammatory properties. All of that is stripped off, and we're left with a caloric bomb, basically. And so everything's wrong with white flour. That would be, you know, my answer. I would like to see, especially when we're approaching sustainability in a sustainable world, when we think about more and more people living here, and grain being, you know, a substantial amount of calories for the population, that we don't refine any of our grain eventually, because we need nutritional density. And so whole grain by itself, whether it's modern wheat, ancient wheat, or any type of grain, unprocessed, is so important for nutrition and for people's sustenance over time, that, you know, when we look at what's been done before in terms of whole grain, we have a lot of research just looking at whole grain, showing the decreased risk of morbidity, so less disease risk from diabetes, obesity, heart disease, cancers. Very solid evidence. If I had to categorize it from A to Z, it's a level A. It's very clear evidence. And the same is for mortality. Whole grains are important pieces of our nutritional composition, and they reduce, you know, mortality significantly. And that's solid research. So why do we continuously promote processing of whole grain? I'm not sure. So whole wheat and whole grain is critical for the future. and nutritional density. What has happened with white flour is that about 70% of all nutrition's gone. And it's gotten so bad that flour had to be enriched. So now you have 5 nutrients back in the flour to make it consumable, right? So justifiable that it has some nutritional value. So to me, everything's wrong with white flour, and whole grain is just something that we need to bring out to the eaters and make them more aware of the nutritional benefits. And that's not easy because people are very weary, and they're really suspicious about wheat these days. And it's a difficult topic, but it's also one that can be easily taught, because you just need to grab people and bring them to grain school and let them bake and let their hands go into the dough and understand how much beauty there is in cooking and sprouting and fermenting this stuff at home. It brings something really beautiful back, and it's our daily bread. Right? Everybody is familiar with that.
So you've acknowledged that the audience is very broad. It's everyone. Do you feel, and in what ways, do you feel a stake in educating bakers, chefs, farmers, and consumers, especially consumers, to understand the benefits of whole grains and of heirloom and ancient grains?
Big stake, right? And I think as an educator already and mentor, I hold a big stake. It's the purpose of my life, right? When I wake up in the morning, to educate everyone and link up this chain so that we have access, right? I can't educate the consumer about it and then the consumer's trying to find it, and we have that issue right now. And there's no access, there's no availability. So it's really critical that we all work together, and perhaps the grain movement has been so inspiring for so many people because it doesn't work without collaboration. It only works with coming together. So whether that's in the kitchen or out in the field.
So, how easy or difficult is it for people to move from not being whole grain users to actively being so? If you could sort of repeat that in some way.
I don't think it's difficult for people to transition to using more whole grains at home. It's not easy to find whole grain products in a grocery store. That's a more difficult question because people have to start reading labels, and for bread it's probably better to go to an artisan bakery and talk with the baker directly. But at home, to me the easiest one is to start substituting all white flour in things like pancakes, in baked mixes, for example, in muffins and shortbread and cookies that they make at home. The holiday season is the perfect place. Any pie crust, anything that they make outside of sourdough baking. Sweetbreads, all of them can be modified with 100% whole grain. There's no need for white flour at all. And then any type of cereal mixes, if families bought flakers, they could make their own rye meal or their oatmeal transferred to another type of grain. They could make their own granolas. That's pretty easy. Their kitchen could be changed in terms of what they're cooking with. All white rice could leave the doorstep, and you could basically make rice with millets, with buckwheats, with any type of wheat, with rye. So you could explore all of that exchange of white rices, white grains, including the pasta. It probably is a different feel for some of that product, especially pasta. Whole wheat pasta is not everybody's favorite. So that requires a little bit more work and a little bit more skill with the pasta roller. but most of the cooking grains and porridges, cereals, and baked goods. Anybody can do this, not difficult.
So when you think about what the methods are for outreach to build a grain chain, have you given thought to beyond the grain school, which is clearly an attempt to bridge across some of these groups and build bridges rather? How do you imagine being able to get the word out to the general public, especially people who aren't attending university?
So one thing that we've successfully done at UCCS is during grain school we have a public forum. And from the beginning on, grain school now happens for the 4th year. From the beginning on, I wanted to have an outreach moment to the general public and make it free to everyone and inspire, people from the community likewise, that they would come, they hear about wheat and learn more about grain, and then at the same time as they're hearing the topics, our students kind of bring out little tasters, and so the public is sitting there tasting the bread, tasting the pizzas, and tasting salads made with perennial grain or with rye, and they have an aha moment and say, what is this? This is really interesting. So our public forum, it was my way of getting something ignited in our community. And nowadays we have people coming up from southern Colorado and northern Colorado to that public forum. It's a free event, it's on Saturday evening. So that was one way. And then throughout the year, what we do at UCCS in our farmhouse, we have grain literacy training through the whole year. So every Friday, we invite the student body to come to learn about grain and baking. So usually the students that take grain school for credit, they have to do service learning through the spring semester. So they come every Friday and do something with grain. Some of that is material development for grain literacy. Some of them is grant writing. So we are working on a curriculum to go to schools and have some grain literacy outreach into schools. And it's an evolving platform, really. Some of it is writing, to magazines, book ideas. So I assume that we cannot stop at grain school. We've also talked about grain school in the field, taking people into the field and run field days like extension services are doing, bringing people to the farmhouse or to environments where grain is grown in the summer, and then showing them how to harvest, how to thresh, how to sourdough ferment, and how to bake. All of those pieces have merit. So wherever consumers are, maybe going to farmers markets and doing grain literacy tables, and trying to bring it to people as much as possible. Writing columns in the newspaper. Why couldn't the Denver Post pick this up? Why couldn't the Boulder Farmers Market have a grain literacy area? I think Noble Grain Alliance has started doing this. So we need to really broadly bring that to people. We've done Slow Food Nation with the whole grain chain, so it was beautiful. We had everyone, really, farmers, millers, bakers. We didn't have brewers on that part, but chefs and educators, dietitians. And the public could come for 3 days to learn about the grain chain and take a bag of flour home and some sourdough starters to start out with. So I think we just have to be creative, just like food literacy. We can no longer teach people in the classroom or in some institutional kitchen. We have to inspire people. And with bread, there is no better venue than getting kids inspired. Right? Baking bread is just beautiful, flavorful.
Yeah. As you were speaking, I was just thinking about how I have some great B-roll, Paul, to go with her references to the Slow Food Nations. Because I went and shot a bunch of footage with a handheld camera of, and also on tripod, at Slow Food Nations. So we'll have that to cut when she's talking here. Okay, this isn't in the interview list, and I wasn't sure how to bring it up, but I'm sure that you've given thought to this subject. So before you answer, I just want you to tell me you're okay with talking about it, since I didn't list it. But it concerns me a lot that there is a perception that this movement is quite elitist, in the sense that it's complex, and it's arising out of it's arising from the minds and efforts of people who tend to be well educated and tend to be privileged. It doesn't mean that the benefits can't be realized by others, but I'm wondering if you've given any thought to that divide between the people who are active in this movement and the people who are suffering the most from things like food deserts and obesity and diabetes, and there's very much a class divide between them. So are you okay with answering, responding to that? Because I figured you would be. I'm sure you've given thought to it. This is something that when I show snippets to people, they say, well, is that something that everybody can enjoy? And I want to be able to respond to that.
Yeah, I guess the question, I'm going to repeat the question, right? There's often this connotation of this movement, this grain movement, just as much as the local and regional food movement being just for the privileged and being an elitist movement. I think slow food has been struggling with this for a long time too. And it is a great challenge for all of us involved. I cannot say that we have moved outside of that parameter, but I think that by being careful who we assemble into this grain movement and from whom we learn, and really from the staff of life, from where it comes from. A loaf of bread should be quite simple, just like a tortilla. Should be quite simple. It should not be related to an expensive process. So it's up to us, who are the leaders in this movement, to bring it back to its inherent core, the staff of life and that loaf of bread or that tortilla or whatever it is that makes it a part of an old food tradition, a meaningful and central food tradition. This year we are inviting a chef from Ghana who will teach us about African grains. Africa is really interesting when you think about grain production. Millet is one of the most often consumed grains in Africa. Sorghum, fonio, which we don't know yet, and get introduced at grain school this year, and teff. These are very simple grains, and some of them are grown in Colorado, and they are very cheap. So it's up to us again to make that bridge to, our children and our schools and the food deserts that you're describing. It's kind of funny because food deserts as a term is oftentimes also quite a debatable term, because grain was grown and is still grown in deserts, very well grown in deserts. It doesn't need a lot of water. So how do we make that movement accessible to those in those deserts? Because they have the right to that. It's a great question. I'm an educator, and I feel very strongly about the school movement. Farm to school is big, but there hasn't really been a discussion around grain. And so there are some bakers that starting to move this too. I can cite a baker from Denver who is very interested in making a step into the schools. So can we bring a grain movement into the schools, and can we link that to more culinary education and culinary curricula in schools for children, so that we see more food literacy embedded already in the younger ones? To me, that's an important one. We also need to collaborate with larger entities, I think, larger industries, because right now, as we're trying to kind of build this grain movement on a small scale, we see quickly that they are specialty products. On our, parameters here, on 30 acres or 10 acres, grain production is for seed production. And then the next farm that has maybe 50 acres or 100 acres will be able to scale up. But the prices are not going to be readily interesting to millers that deal with very low prices for wheat. So I think it's going to be a very difficult process to make this available to everyone. But it's a really important topic, and we should probably also invite, people that still know how to make tortillas. The students from Mexico that I have in my curriculum don't know how to make tortillas. They never learned it. So, but I'm sure that we have people here in the communities that still know how to make tortillas. And there's a lot embedded in the culture in Europe where, breads are still baked with traditional sourdough methods. And certainly the wheat kind of sourdough baking artisanship that has been coming back. Anybody can make and can access whole wheat flour, right? Whole wheat flour is not that much more expensive, but it's the education that people need. Why do we all eat white tortillas? So,
It's funny, this past week I bought a cast iron tortilla press. I decided because we are going to have tacos on New Year's Eve, and I decided I want to start making my own tortillas. So finally.
Yeah. That's good.
So I did want to ask you some questions about sourdough, but I want to continue on this conversation, and the sourdough would be an interruption. So maybe we can come back to that later. But I more about this the resistance, because I say some questions about the resistance to, and as I see it, there are consumer aspects of resistance, like, do I have to own my own mill? Do I have to have my own flaker? Do I have to start taking a lot of time to bake? And so there's that. But then there's also the industry and the scale that they want to produce at. The wheat industry, the baking industries, and all of the other industries that are involved in making use of wheat for various purposes, in processed foods and in pasta and whatever. What do you see as some of the principal obstacles to get like major companies to embrace rather than resist the kinds of things that, because it's hard for me to imagine that these companies will go away. The question is, can they be brought along? And I know from talking with Andy Clark that Ardent Mills is approaching him, and he's talking with them, and this person from the Kansas, some kind of Kansas Wheat Growers Association, I'm not sure what the name of it is, has been going after Andy lately and trying to talk with him about getting involved in them getting involved in what he's doing, and he's been skeptical, but at the same time he recognizes that if this kind of if the benefits are going to scale up, you need big players to some extent, because that form of agriculture isn't going to go away. And that scale of industrial production is probably not going to go away overnight, or if ever. So, what do you see industry as a stumbling block? Do you see them as partners? Do you reach out to them?
I see them. I see many of them as partners. But
Could you start over? I see industry.
I see industry. Some industry as partners. I think the whole grain, market has already shown that, right? The whole grain recommendations have already been taken on by many industries and many companies. So to me, some industries will pick that up and others will fight it. I really hesitate to say, and I really don't think that the ancient grain movement will become mainstream. I think, especially when we think about the einkorn market and the fact that einkorn yields are so much lower than modern wheat, even than spelt. I don't believe that einkorn will ever make it unless the breeders are bringing out einkorn with an increased yield, and they are working on this, certainly, and free threshing, accessions of einkorn. That's the breeding world, and they're probably going to come up with some ways to do that. But the resistance is also there. I think the food industry will go where the consumers go, right? The demand oftentimes determines the market, and so to me, if the consumer asks for certain products and asks for more ancient grains, the industry will go there. But the industry is also very fast in adulterating these products. So you could see an ancient grain product and it is mostly oats, and down the line somewhere is quinoa, and that's the ancient grain product. And so we really have to be very transparent, just like with the local food and the sustainable food system in general. Where is our transparency here? Oftentimes these days you find Italian pasta and it has American wheat in it. I think if the Italians knew it, they probably wouldn't eat it or would get more skeptical. So I think that this is a very difficult question. How do we move consumers to eaters? So there's a really interesting economist in Germany, Nico Pech, that I follow, who says that without having people move more to the land and in some way get connected again with their food, they will not become better eaters. They will just not understand or have no relationship with what's on their plate. And so I believe that too. I think we have completely failed as educators in trying to reestablish this relationship to food in the consumer. Once consumers start to become prosumers or eaters, more active eaters, asking for that transparency, things will not change. When people just want the flavor or the crusty baguette, they don't understand the real value of the grain. They don't even know that the baguette ultimately comes from a wheat that has a kernel, So it's really food literacy. People just don't know. And so without that consumer knowledge and education and demand, I'm not sure that the industry will fully jump on it, because they're still sort of going with business as usual. I think we're all kind of going with business as usual. But once these crops kind of come to the surface in a climate change ridden environment too, once they are shown to be the winners, they're going to become very interesting for the wheat growers, because they might be varieties that are more pest resistant. They might be varieties that are more drought resistant. And suddenly, there's this urgency that comes. How much longer is the obesity epidemic going to last in this country? How much longer until our institutions realize what they have to do for school nutrition? We have to change. So I assume when the little ones get that education and they become the 20-year-olds, we have eaters and food citizens that will ask for the grain, and they will know the sourdough loaf.
I want to, why don't we, I want to ask you about infrastructures last, but just your thoughts on it, not an elaborate response, because I think we're going to catch some interesting things at the grain school about this topic, and there's no reason to go over it too much now. Could you say a little bit about both sourdough and flavor? Because from what I can, my own personal experience in eating and developing increasingly whole grain loaves is that the flavor is so much more intense and superior. And that's not something easy to communicate. Flavor is not something that you can talk about very easily. And I'm wondering if you, how you try to excite people about the flavor of whole grains.
I probably start not with sourdough, even though sourdough fermentation in bread brings out the flavor. But we've taken this very hidden approach at UCCS with our students with cookies, and using whole grains and ancient grains in cookies, 100% whole grain, with blue corn and einkorn and rye and spelt. And when you bake cookies with whole grain, the flavor is amazing. And so, and it's probably also masked by a lot of butter and sugar and other things. And everybody, gets lured in with cookies. People just like cookies. So what we've seen with young students, when there's a menu item, in a dining hall that has whole grains in it, or the students have just put out a heritage or an ancient grain sourdough loaf with some soup, we typically lure them in with cookies, and then they learn about, whole grain, that's interesting, and we direct them to that station, and then they try a piece of bread and the soup along with it, and they say, this is really good. Oh my God, where can I get this? So I really think that we have to be wise with our approach and find all sorts of ways. I think a tortilla too, when you take a tortilla and you make it fresh with whole corn, nixtamalized and freshly pressed, the flavor is amazing. It brings tears probably to those that have, experienced this at home 20 years ago. So we just need to latch on to innovative ways in making people hungry for this stuff. So whole grains are incredibly flavorful, and they can be mixed in all sorts of ways. And when you actually process them in various ways, if you sprout them, or if you roast them and then mill them into a cookie, the flavor is very different. Roasted or malted grain has an incredible flavor profile. So it's really interesting for somebody in culinary to continue to explore. It's never ending. And then when you go into sourdough baking, the flavor of a fermented loaf is just very different. And I think the sourness is also very, very individual. Some people really like that sour taste and some people don't, but you can ferment without making a loaf too sour. You just have to understand temperature and time. And then the different grains too. When you use whole grain and it's freshly milled, that grain is really active, right? The enzymatic activity is amazing. But it also creates a very sour flavor quickly. So it's quite interesting to me how to work with time and temperature in fermentation to change the sourness of the loaf. And then how you bake it, right? How long do you bake it, and how does that crust then get a flavor, and with what in it? Do you add malt sugar or some molasses, for example, like in combination with rye and different spices such as fennel or anise? The flavor changes again. So the world is just really big. The grain world is fantastic.
One last question, and this has been wonderful. I learned so much when I'm doing these interviews, and I'm really enjoying your responses. About local, regional grain economies and infrastructures, what do you consider to be the primary elements of a local or regional grain economy, and what do you consider to be the necessary infrastructure for creating a local grain economy?
Great question. Local grain economies are nothing without production, so they start with farming. So we need a lot of interested farmers to take on these heritage and ancient grains. And for me, from the beginning, I think there was quite a resistance in the farming realm, because we came with little trial grain and asked our larger scale farmers to do a grain trial with 25 seeds. And that just didn't work. So luckily we were able to do some backyard farming and grain trials with our smaller farmers and bring them up to scale. So at least we have enough seeds, or probably not quite yet enough seed to distribute to larger farms, but I think it starts with that piece. We need to have the seed to be able to grow it at a larger scale. And if we are interested in hulled grains, we need to have dehullers, and we need to have bins for storage. Every farm probably will have to have a certain amount of infrastructure to get grain off the field into a truck. So a combine probably is necessary, into a truck and into bins, so that they can safely store. Storage is also critical, because grain is extremely vulnerable to pests very fast, right? So we need to be able to have a food safe process into storage, and then from storage perhaps there is a chance for us to build cooperatives or alignments amongst farmers that contribute all to a seed cleaning facility. Seed cleaning, especially for einkorn, emmer, and spelt for the hulled grains, is critical, and it's very difficult and expensive. So how are we going to build that infrastructure? It doesn't exist at this point in Colorado. And so, at least on that small scale. So I think that's the next step for us. And once we have that, I think we also need to work with millers. So it's quite interesting. Many millers have seed cleaning facilities. So is it the miller that will do the seed cleaning? And then the miller has to have a food safe storage capability and processing, so that bags can be filled, closed shut, and distributed. Right? So the distribution is also really critical, and that needs trucks. Again, quite an expensive process. And we want to keep the distances as small as possible, but the distribution is quite an important one, and it's a money saver. Because right now our bakers are getting grains from Arizona and from California and from Georgia, from Montana, and that shipping cost is tremendous. So once we have a regional chain, they can save quite a lot of money. And so it's an important piece of economics when you think about the distribution. And then, 50-pound bags is great for a baker, but what are we doing to move this to the farmer's market, to the CSAs, to grocery stores? So we need a smaller packaging facility. So I guess this whole grain chain starts with farming. That's for me the most important part. And if we want to make it regional, we have Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, Kansas, New Mexico as our regional area, probably Montana. And we have farmer alliances already established, especially with Rocky Mountain Farmers Union that covers Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico, helping with their cooperative development specialists to develop a cooperative environment that helps to facilitate that process. Hopefully, grain chains are viable here at the Front Range. I like to see some European models. There's 1 mill, 60 farmers, 40 bakers. So how can we learn from European models in Italy, France, Germany, and Switzerland, Austria? Really good models out there. Scandinavia, Israel, probably. Yeah.
Excellent.
Okay.
This is good. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
This is fantastic.
So what we'll do before you get up, go ahead and hold your positions real quick. We'll record 20 seconds of just room noise for editing purposes, and I can even put a stopwatch on this. So beginning. Okay, we're good on that one. And then before you leave, I'm going to stop the record